Whenever Renaissance Collective shows up anywhere,
Yeah.
they're like a energy gang.
Oh, really? That's great.
They just like light up the room. Yeah. Hi everyone. Good to see you all at the town hall. Nice to see some familiar faces as always. And just for quick background, in case this is your first time attending, we're DK and Mishti from the Highlighter team and Leon from Renaissance Collective. And we're building Highlighter as a place to gather to read and discuss great writing. And so these town halls have been a way for us to bring writers into the mix to jam with us and dig deeper on their ideas. And we've recently been doing some sessions with more deeply researched long form pieces like Polina's with the profile. And so we have a link for the profile that we're going to share in chat. So you probably have already been reading it, but just want to make sure that that's top of mind for you. And this is a special edition of Highlighter Live because it's our very first collab. So we're doing a collaboration with the Renaissance Collective. Now, as I was mentioning before we got started here, whenever the Renaissance Collective shows up, they bring all the energy. They're like an energy gang, I call it. And we're fortunate to be able to collab with them today. So we've got great energy from the Renaissance Collective people. And then as well, Leon is a Renaissance Collective member. And he also writes, he's a fellow newsletter writer, and he's going to be leading the moderation of the discussion today. Renaissance Collective, for those of you who haven't heard, is a community of smart generalists who help each other navigate careers in tech. And we'll have a link in the chat for that. So if you want to learn more about Renaissance Collective, and we'll also have a link to Leon's newsletter.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this, especially today. Polina, I feel like I said this on Twitter, but a lot of us, especially in Renco, think a lot about transitions and career transitions. And especially at this time, like there's so much uncertainty in the world. And I think that you have sort of been through a lot of transitions in your life. Like I was reading that you moved here in 4th grade from Bulgaria to teach yourself English, and now like starting this whole new venture in the middle of a global pandemic. So I am really excited to learn from you and how you navigate all of that, staying very true to yourself.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Cool. Now, one quick housekeeping note on the format. The magic of the town hall is when we just keep it really participatory. So Leon is going to kick this all off, and he's going to help moderate and run the show. But please do chime in with your own ideas and questions on chat. So we got the chat already kind of going over there. So feel free to chime in with the chat. And if you have questions as they come up, either stuff you've already thought about or stuff that is inspired by the conversation, feel free to mention it in the chat, and we'll bring you up and unmute you and bring you up to ask Polina your questions live. So we'll welcome you up as those happen. Another little note is we are recording the session and we're streaming it live to YouTube right now.
Oh, wow.
And we're
glad we shared the clown anecdote.
Oh, actually, we always like to kick them off with a little funny moment, so maybe that'll make it. But we do a little bit of post-production, and then we turn it into a useful video that other people who couldn't attend with us tonight can still learn from the discussion, and we end up getting a lot of people who follow up afterwards asking about that. So I'm sure this will be a hotly attended video on YouTube.
Awesome.
Yeah, totally. And we're going to hand over to Leon to intro Polina and kick it off. But in the spirit of getting everyone involved, I do have a question for people to chime in on chat. Who is your next dream subject for Polina's profile dossier?
Oh,
so
that's a tricky question.
This is actually helpful for me, so please do.
But thanks, Mishi, for the intro. So now I can introduce Polina with and talk about her term sheet background, about the profile that she writes, about the people she's interviewed, which also includes a Renaissance Collective member, Emily, who's also in attendance today. So that's actually pretty fun. But I mean, you guys don't know all of that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell a short story about Polina. So as some of you know, I write a newsletter myself, and I've been writing for quite some time. Writing's a pretty personal activity, right? So it's often pretty solitary. And all my years of writing so far, there's only ever been one person I've asked to formally edit my work, and that's Polina. So I think that goes to show how highly I regard her work. But not only that, that's actually a follow-up to the story. So that's what happened after I got her feedback. Now, I think of myself as a pretty decent writer. I mean, I've been writing for a while, and people giving me feedback, blah, blah, blah. I think I'm okay, passable. So like when Polina gave me her feedback in like her usual friendly, oh, here's a few comments, but I think this looks great. So like I opened the doc like expecting, oh, just a couple of comments here and there. I'm gonna make small changes, nothing major. And instead, like I see the entire doc has like comments everywhere. And I'm like, what is up with that? So I started going through all of them thinking like, oh crap. And at the end I realized like, you know what? These are all actually valid, excellent points. And now I have to rewrite my entire article. So which I did. And it was definitely better after. So thanks Pauline for that. I think the lesson here is to not let Polina look at your work or you feel like insecurity complex forever. But I think joke aside, Polina, I think one thing that a lot of the audience here would like to know is how you got so good at writing. So like what your writing process is, any tips on that? So I'm going to kick it off with the first question in terms of what are you practicing deliberately? For example, like how a football player might train drills, how a chess player might like train openings. Like what do you do like in terms of deliberate practice? And this can be just in writing or anything that you want to talk about as well.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. And your piece was excellent. I love the little comment function, so I just leave comments. But I think really good writers were actually really, really bad. Fun fact, Emily Hughes, who's here, she was the first profile I ever wrote for Fortune. And I wasn't even a reporter at the time. I was doing social media, and Patty Sellers, who was, she was like my idol. She was a reporter at Fortune for 33 years. She was like, hey, did you know that there's an Olympian who went to the Olympics for ice skating and she's working at Google? And I was like, I did not, but sounds like a really interesting story. So I worked on a profile on Emily, and what she doesn't know is that there were many drafts before what was eventually published, but because it was my first article, like I literally sat at a Starbucks for hours just trying to make it good. And at the end, I felt so good about it. And I was like, Patty, the queen of profiles, is gonna love this. I turn it in, and I still have it actually. I wish it was here. I still have it. It's stapled. I wrote 5 pages front and back for an article that was supposed to be like 700 words. 3 of the pages, Patty just went ahead and there's 3 big X's, not like little edits. She just like X'd it out. I was like, okay, so I guess we're not talking about that part of Emily's life. And then she made it so much better, right? But this always happens to me. Even I've been at Fortune for 5 years. I've been writing articles since high school, and the beauty of writing is like it's very subjective, but you can always get better. And the biggest lesson that I learned, and the thing that I'm deliberately practicing now and always, is that when I was at Fortune, I wrote this really big story in the magazine, and it was about a venture capital firm that was kind of, they were having problems. It was a very hard story for me to write, mainly because I came in not knowing a lot of the players. I wasn't familiar with Kleiner Perkins, that was the venture firm. So I had to do a lot of research. The editor that I was working with is very, very good. And he basically, I mean, if you thought what I left on your story was a lot, like I was like, I can't see my original story from all of this. But when I turned it in, I thought it was really good. And his reaction to my really good was, what is this? And I was like, well, like, what do you, it was stabbed me in the heart. It was a lot. And because I'm a very like sensitive person, for writing and editing, like it's fine. But when somebody has a reaction to like, this needs a lot of work, you're like, oh, okay. The thing that he told me that stuck with me, and I think a lot of us do this just in everyday life, is that he said, I can tell that your thinking is sloppy, therefore your writing is also sloppy. What he meant by that is, you write in absolutes. You see the world kind of black and white. You're missing nuance. You're missing detail. You're missing like examples and anecdotes. And so I think a lot of us, when we start writing, we start with this like pie in the sky, like here's how I see the world. The problem with that type of thinking is that it doesn't translate well at all in writing. So the best stories that I've read are full of nuance, full of very specific detail. And if you go back and read that Kleiner Perkins story, every sentence is like detail, 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 nuance, detail, detail. And the reason that's powerful is because you're able to back everything up, right? When you write things like, no one in the company liked the CEO, that's not true. Like, you immediately lose credibility with the reader because they know that is false, subjectively false. There's always someone who liked them. There's always nuance. And I think, like, especially now with politics, everything's become so black and white. There's no gray. And if you're a writer who's able to be precise in your thinking and precise in the words you use, every word is deliberate, you're gonna stand out from everybody else.
Gotcha. That's, I think, like the point about just the whole misunderstanding of like, and like getting feedback and then like sharpening your thinking. I think that's, for a lot of writers, I think that is why they do write, right? Like, you write in order to shape and make sure that you really understand what you're talking about. We actually got some good questions from the audience in terms of feedback from both Nadia and Ali. They are pretty similar. I'm going to call on Nadia to ask a question regarding like feedback. Nadia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Polina, I thought such an amazing story. Nice to meet you. And I'm curious, like, how did you handle that feedback? Because it sounds like it was sort of like an emotional gut punch, which I totally relate to. And like, how did you not take it personally? And I think Ali had a similar question of just like, you know, has your approach to feedback changed over time, or has it gotten easier?
Yeah, it has gotten a little easier, but like with that story especially, it took me 6 months. So it was like a prolonged punch. It was hard for me in the beginning, like the very first, because I wrote like 4 or 5 drafts by the end, but the first one, I just had to keep reminding myself, this person has my best interests at heart. He wouldn't be hard on me if he didn't think I could handle it, right? And I think like, it's like with any job, I try to compartmentalize my writing at work versus like my personal writing. But I think of it as like, this is my boss, like he wants me to get better. He's doing it for the better of the organization, the magazine, making the thing. But I learned so much. Like, you know how sometimes you read your stuff and you're like, oh yeah, this is good. And then somebody else gives you feedback and you're like, oh, how did I not see that? And the reason you don't see it is because you're in the weeds and you're so focused on it, you can't zoom out. So it gets less emotional over time, but those 6 months were like rough. It's really interesting how, because all day, every day, I was thinking about the story and how I was going to structure it, I started doing a lot of jigsaw puzzles and it helped my brain kind of like put something together and organize it. But it's also kind of like a form of like weirdly meditation where you let your mind wander as you do something. So I find that when there's a lot of chaos, doing something like that gives you a sense of like it rewards your need for organization and something coming together.
I think, I mean, that sounds like we're all like in pursuit of this whole like perfection. It's like the perfect essay, like after all the feedback and everything. Ali in the audience also has a question regarding like when do you actually stop? Ali, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Polina, nice to meet you.
Hi Ali.
Excited to talk to you. Yeah, my question is sort of the inverse of it, is like sometimes as a freelance journalist, I'll sometimes get so lost in the weeds of like trying to add nuance or explain every sentence that it will just take hours and hours to report on like, yeah, you need to find out like, does every person dislike the CEO? And that takes, you know, thousands of interviews or whatever it is. Like, when do you stop and just rephrase your sentence to like avoid making an error, but not kind of get into a wormhole? How do you find the balance of like what nuance is necessary and which is too much?
Yes, so I think the best way to do that is to send it to friends who have no idea like what the subject you're writing about is. So let's say I'm writing about, so I wrote a very complicated story about a venture capital firm with a growth unit and a venture unit and how they like all these different things that like honestly for me were complicated, let alone your average casual reader who would be reading the story. It wouldn't be interesting to them because I would be writing it. That was my editor's biggest, he hates jargon. So anytime I said like they raised seed funding. He's like, what the hell is seed funding? You have to explain. They raised the first round of funding to capitalize their company or whatever. Over explaining is good, except I think sometimes it is easy to get lost in the detail and you're so in it. So I suggest like sending it to somebody who has no idea what you're writing about, is not familiar with that world, and ask them like, did I beat you over the head with unnecessary detail? Because sometimes it is possible. Like sometimes you need to step back and like make it a little more generic, not generic, but like a little more like loose and not as like, and this happened on September 8th, 2019, and then the next day, like it gets confusing at a certain point. So definitely somebody who's detached from that world, and ask them if literally it makes sense. But yeah, I think it's a balance. I always say it's good to have all the detail and all the stuff because you might need it. It's worse to not have it and then go back and get it. So always err on that side. You can always delete.
So I think that probably covers Ryan's question as well regarding like brevity versus cutting down. So I do want to talk more about like things that you mentioned, like the whole editing process being kind of like behind the scenes. Like people don't realize that like you had 6 drafts over 6 months and like half of it was taken out. In terms of writing, like what's a common belief about writing that people might have that you think is actually wrong and mistaken?
I wrote about this recently about how the creative process is just you sitting around waiting to be inspired by something. Like I've never been inspired. Never once in my life have I sat down and been like, oh yeah, like I'm inspired to write. My muse is here. I think literally it's just typing, and then it's ugly and it's horrible and I can barely look at it on the page, but then going back and massaging it and changing sentence structure, all that nerdy stuff that writers like. But I genuinely think like the most important thing is just to start doing it, no matter, I mean, I know people, these are the people, so when people ask me like, hey, Polina, should I start a newsletter? And I'm like, no, you shouldn't, because I know that you're not going to do it consistently, because doing something consistently takes away that whole, like, I need to be inspired. Like consistency is like, but I did a newsletter at Fortune every single morning. I know some days were probably not that great, but other days were, just because of the repetition, and you get better and your thinking gets sharper and you remember things. So I think like most people just see the final result and they think like, oh, she was inspired and she sat down and wrote it. I think iteration, editing, cutting, slashing, like all of that is very beautiful in the creative process.
Yeah, I actually want to ask you a little bit about that, and this gets into productivity a little bit, but in terms of like, it's just so important to get reps and get stuff out there. How do you balance getting into kind of a flow state where you're actually writing and getting stuff out with all the content consumption that you must be doing? Like you've talked about your media diet, and especially as someone running your own business, I'm sure you're on Twitter and email and all these things all the time. Sort of how do you chunk your time to balance those?
Yeah. So, you know how people say like, oh, I don't have any ideas. To avoid that, whenever I listen to a podcast or watch something interesting, I just either type it in my notes or I send an email to myself with the thing that I found interesting, with like a quick sentence on like why this is interesting and what I could write about it in the future. So I have this like list of ideas over time that I've wanted to expand upon. But yeah, I think people, I know so many people who are just afraid of putting their writing in public because they think it's bad and people will judge them. Like, trust me, there are not a lot of people sitting around judging other people's writing. So seriously, like if you look back, it's still online, at the first profile I wrote, I mean, it was terrible in that the voice was wrong, the tone was wrong, there was a gif of Elon Musk drinking whiskey, everything was wrong. But the bones of it like were there. What was it? I think it was this week. I did, it was this week. I did a dossier on Brandon Stanton, the photographer behind Humans of New York. He said that Humans of New York would have never become what it is today if he hadn't just started. And his initial idea for Humans of New York was to take 10,000 photographs of people in New York, no quote, no interview, nothing, just portraits, and plot them all on a map on the 5 boroughs. Okay, that's somewhat interesting, but he wasn't planning on asking their permission. He wasn't planning on sitting them down and being like, hey, can I take your photo and what's your life story? But if he hadn't started with that bad idea, he would have never gotten to where it is today, where like literally he just raised $1.1 million for a woman based on her story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like when people ask me about writing, like how do you write, like what do you write about, or like how do you get better? Like, I mean, there's a simple answer, right? It's a very simple like cliche of just write.
Yeah.
And it's simple, but it's not easy because to your point, like the consistency of writing something like every day or even every week, or even like every month, like it is incredibly challenging. Like a lot of people will start writing, and I think you've seen this in Substack as well, in which you see a lot of people have started Substacks.
Yeah.
And they'll have like 1 issue, 2 issues, and then past like the first month of realizing that, this is actually not quite as fun as I thought it was going to be. Like a lot of people drop off after that. In terms of this whole like getting started, I think Nadia has a good question about being blocked and getting started. Nadia, do you want to ask your question again?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so much of what you said is so relatable about like not having like a muse, or like the inspo hits you like a lightning bolt. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, I think both writing and entrepreneurship, there's sort of this sense of like, you know, do you have the idea, and like how do you get started or unblocked if you don't feel like you have sort of like the one, and how do you get going when, you know, you're trying to think about like where do you even begin?
This may sound really silly, but sometimes something I sometimes do is like I go to my bookshelf and I'll just take a random book and open it to a random page and be like, oh, that's interesting. And like I have one that's profile, like the best profiles of the New Yorker over the last like century or whatever. So like, you know, that book is probably an easier sell than like the Bible. But when you open a random book and then you start reading and then you start thinking, like the way I do it is I'll have an idea and then I'll talk to friends about it and ask them, like Deb, Kara, and Jenna who are in here, I've literally asked them things that I want to hear their take on, so then I can like kind of be like, oh, okay, this is how you think about this. Talking to other people is like the best way to get ideas. Like, what is interesting to you right now? What are you thinking about? Also, taking walks. Sounds stupid, but again, like when you're walking, okay, this is how I got my idea. When I left Fortune, I did for the profile, I published, I think it was an 8-part series on small business owners and how they were dealing with like the beginning of the pandemic and the shutdown. The way I got that idea was I was walking down the street and I started seeing more and more people being like, closed temporarily, closed permanently, closed whatever. And I'm like, how are they doing this? And so I decided to like call them up, and it became like a series of really cool entrepreneurs talking about how they're handling the pandemic. I just reached back out to them, and some of them have shut down permanently. So just like literally just walking, you can get an idea.
Right. On this topic of like whole like idea generation, where you get inspiration from, Christian in our audience also has a question on that. Christian pronounced Carl apparently.
That's right. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Just wanted to ask about what's an example of an idea that you've not written about yet, but you like have really wanted to for a really long time.
Ooh, that I have not written about yet.
Yeah, you said you had that list of like, here's
Hold
the things
on
that
one
haven't quite
second.
written about yet.
I have it right here. One sec.
Ooh, so cool. We're going live.
No, this is just like live, my computer being really slow. Okay. Oh, okay. So for example, this one I wrote, yep, it doesn't have a whole lot of, hold on one second. Okay, yeah. So I want to write something about what labels do to your psychology. Like when you are labeled as one type of person, what does that do to you? I read this thing, I forget who it was. It was some either like CEO or famous person. They started or was it, I don't know. They started a fire when they were a little kid and burned down like a whole school or something crazy. But they didn't obviously go to jail. They didn't go to prison. Weren't labeled like an arsonist or whatever you're called. Mm-hmm. But if that had happened later in life, and if he wasn't at a private school, and if he wasn't, his parents didn't say like, listen, this was an accident, this is okay. Depending on where you find yourself in life, you can get slapped with a really bad label that can like haunt you forever. And my question is like, basically first of all, the labels that we're willing to attach to ourselves, and two, the labels society kind of slaps on us, and how do you like grow from that? So if you have any ideas, let me know, but that's one I've been wanting to write.
There actually, if I can hop in, there is a study that did something like that. It was like it was a classroom of kids. They divided them into like kids with blue eyes and kids with brown eyes, and then like some of the social dynamics that arose from that, and like there was all this, like they would give the blue-eyed kids favors, and like the brown-eyed kids would have less like playtime at lunch, and it was really fascinating. So maybe look that up as you want to get some info.
Exactly. That is exactly what I'm looking for. Yes, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that study is done by Jane Elliott. So she's still alive. So the teacher who did that study, so she's still alive today, and she gives like this fantastic like anti-racism talks, and just like going through her experience, like exactly talking about that, saying that like something as simple as that like profoundly changes your experience. So she goes around to like these states that are, I guess, known for having like racial issues, and then she goes and talks to people about their experiment, hopefully like tries to convince them to change. You post a link in the chat real quick. And I think
awesome.
you have a question.
Yeah, this is a really good profile actually. She's pretty interesting.
Oh, this is great. Thank you guys. You're actually doing all the work for me.
I do want to ask Polina, actually, you've talked a couple times, and I think on Highlighter, you also mentioned kind of the importance, especially for an independent creator, of building like your personal sounding board. So you mentioned Telegram groups or your friends, some of whom are here, who you might send articles to. What advice would you have for people who are starting out and sort of trying to collect their sounding boards, especially for people who are new to Twitter and some of these spaces? I think it can be difficult to get plugged in.
Yes, so there's two types of people you should have, I think. So first, I think, so you know how when you want to do something in life and you're like, for example, for me, it was, hey, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to write a newsletter and I'm going to make money off of it. My family and friends who like really care about me are like, are you fucking insane? but because they told me that, and I had to like, some of them did. And I had to use all this like energy to convince them that it was the right thing to do. That was taking away from my time to brainstorm with like-minded people. So Shonda Rhimes said this. She said, normalize your life by whatever choice in the world you want to make, whatever like you want to do. Find a group in which your desired behavior is the normal behavior. So like for me, talking about newsletters as businesses was the normal behavior. Instead of me trying to spend all this time like convincing people why it's a good idea, I was able to join a group on Telegram with all these other newsletter writers who I didn't know, had never met in real life, but we were able to talk about ideas and brainstorm, and it's so much easier than having to like convince people of something you want to do. The other group though should be the family and friends who are like kind of act as the brakes, right? You should have those people, and that's important because you need like balance. You shouldn't like go off the deep end. But to me, like family and friends are where I get most of my ideas from. Like for example, I recently wrote something on democracy after I saw what was going on in Belarus, and the way I had this idea, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder why this is happening now. I called my dad, and he sees the world totally differently because his perspective is he lived through communism in Bulgaria where he did not trust the government, and he, like to him the government is not something like it's an entity where like they want to like take your freedom, and I don't come from that mentality. And I was trying to understand him, and like we were trying to have a conversation. So I think before you get into an argument with someone, try to understand where they're coming from and why they think that way. But also, I've had the most interesting conversations with people who we don't see eye to eye on. So you need both those types of people in your life.
When you're looking for people who might be like a Telegram group style, you know, kind of a support network, are you finding people that are kind of thematically similar to the kinds of interests you have, or is it a bunch of people who are interested in kind of people profile type stuff or kind of journalism, or would you have like a science fiction writer in that same kind of group?
So I'm a part of a few groups. One of them is, if you like read the profile, there is a Telegram group with only profile readers like in the community. So we talk about profiles, we talk about ideas, like various things. They can be an accountant to a reporter to a CEO. There's another group called the Type House, not to be confused with the Hype House, where super nerdy, but great. So it's a bunch of people who are either newsletter writers. I think they're, Leon, would you say they're all newsletter writers?
Yeah, everybody there, they're intended to all be newsletter writers. I think there's some that are inactive that might have like stopped, but it was intended for everybody to write. Yeah.
So it was intended for that goal. So everybody's kind of like like-minded in that respect, but I've seen a lot of like challenging of opinions and a lot of like good criticism and people defending the idea. So I think it's like a healthy debate, and I really love that because it's not everybody being like everybody should be a newsletter writer. It's like a lot of like, well, have you thought about this, and what about this, and like this happened in 2001, and so it's like it's a good mix of people who think differently but like the same stuff.
Yeah, how did you find these groups? I mean, it's probably different for each one, but do you have any tips on how to sort of get into those groups? And even on Twitter, like, is there a way that you manage your Twitter for different kinds of discovery of media from different like areas?
Yeah, so when I was at Fortune, I created lists on Twitter. So I created the like venture capital and tech list, I created a media list, and then just my regular feed. But I think I've curated my Twitter so well that it's like perfect, like don't touch it. But so when I left Fortune and I started the profile and like doing it full time in March, the biggest thing I was really nervous about is, am I gonna miss out on all this like meeting new people because of the pandemic? Like, how am I gonna meet new people now? And how am I gonna have these conversations? And what I found is that literally the majority of my network now is through people I have met online and have talked to online and done Zoom calls with. So by talking to those people, like I think, I was talking to Dan Schipper, and he was like, oh, by the way, did you know we have this group? Do you want to be part of it? And I was like, sure, I'll join anything at this point, but it was a good one to join. And yeah, I think, well, there is also like fatigue of joining too much, especially during the pandemic. But if you can find like-minded people, I like it when it's relatively like small. So like when it gets too big, it gets out of control. And yeah, just finding those communities online has never been easier.
Yeah, I think like, I mean, the group that we are in, like the Type House, because we have a good mix of different people there, right? Like you have people who write about media, you have people who write about fintech. So I think we have a broad range of perspectives there. And yeah, totally agree on like trying to get as many different ideas, because like if you're only reading the same thing the entire day, that's all you're going to be able to write about, right? Because you don't have like that broad perspective. I think especially as a reporter, you would have that that mentality. And from our audience, Ashay has a good question just regarding like the diversity of the material that you cover. Ashay, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for doing this, by the way. My question was, you know, you mentioned you try to sort of bring a balanced perspective and look at it from the other person's point of view. When you're thinking about guests or people to profile, do you actively try to look for people that you don't necessarily see eye to eye with?
No, I try to look for people who are interesting to me. And the beauty of that is that a lot of times I don't agree with them. I am working on one right now on David Goggins. He is like absolutely insane in that, he was a SEAL, then he does ultra marathons, he does like 100-mile races. And his whole message is like push, 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 suffer, suffer, pain, all this stuff. I don't agree with that to an extent, but I like the message. And I think he's interesting because he's been able to reinvent himself. Like we were talking about labels. He was obese. He was labeled as with a learning disability. He was severely bullied in school. His father was abusive. He came out of that and created this like alter ego of I'm a warrior and I can endure anything. And you think you can like outwork me, you can't. That's an extreme. But then I'm also working on one on Cheryl Strayed. Cheryl Strayed is not like that, but she has the same message of like, you can reinvent yourself. So for me, I think the biggest like common thread is like, you don't have to be what people tell you to be. And you can always reinvent yourself no matter like how old you are or what stage in your life you are.
I wonder if I could pull a thread there because it's another question I'd been stewing on for a moment. I have this question about authenticity. So I know that, if you read, a big, biography about a famous person, it oftentimes has, there's some element of kind of hero worship or kind of telling this type of story that people are expecting to hear, like people want to hear about the hero. But then when you actually spend time with people, you probably understand there's nooks and crannies and good and bad and kind of more authentic people. And I wonder, do you feel tension while you're writing a profile about somebody to kind of boost them up and give them a great visibility while trying to sort of blend in some of the more organic or some of the failures or faults that you might recognize?
Yeah, definitely emphasize the faults because I think people are only relatable if you see them fail. Like nobody only triumphs, nobody always like wins. And the thing about a great, compelling profile is one where they succeeded, they failed, there was redemption, there was maybe another failure, there was a success again. It's like when you lose everything, how do you rebuild? And people are just looking for lessons on if everything's taken away from me, how can I move on with my life, etc. It's interesting you say that. I was actually pretty young when I read the biography by Ashley Vance on Elon Musk. And I didn't know anything about Elon, actually. I just knew, like, because I had just started at Fortune and I heard people talking about him, like if he was this like God. So I was like, who is this guy? Started reading, but because I went into it like not expecting him to be brilliant, I was like, wow, like this is so interesting. But the thing that I took away from it is look at how his personal life affected his brain. There's one detail in that book. He never talks about it. You won't find it in pretty much any profile. He lost a child really early on in his marriage. And he kind of, if you notice, there was a shift. Like he was willing to work really hard, but that event happened and he poured himself into that company completely, into his work completely. And it's like, because we don't talk about the human element of people's journeys, I think we lose a lot of the humanity. I think that Elon Musk is a human being just like you and me. You don't know how a tragic event like that might affect you. It affected him in that way. It might affect me completely different, but it like noticing that stuff and thinking about that, I think brings them down to earth a little bit more.
Right. So I want to switch gears a bit and go back to like the writing, more of the writing process. Laura had a good question on that a lot of people seem to resonate with in terms of short versus long pieces. Laura, do you want to ask a question?
unmute myself. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I'm so motivated to write again.
Good.
Do you ever ask, we're talking about the list of ideas. I feel like I have a long list of book titles or report titles. And sometimes I wonder whether this is just worth a tweet. Is it worth more effort? I have this love-hate relationship with actually doing the work. Like, part of me thinks I have this idea, I wish it could just be done.
Yeah.
Do you ever struggle between like having the idea, wanting it done, and then, enjoying the process, but then resenting the time it takes to actually do something meaningful? And how do you balance? How do you kind of segment your ideas across the different platforms and links?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times, that's a great question. I think a lot of times we're stopped from completing something because it looks so massive, something like a book. I can't even, right now thinking about writing a book, I can't even wrap my head around it. But I had this idea last year when I was like, I would really love to write a book with where each chapter was a different person and what we could learn from them and all this stuff. And I was like, but I genuinely don't have the time. And I was thinking about that today. I was like, wow, how funny and ironic is it that I thought about this, and then I started doing the profile Dossier. It's literally a deep dive on an individual person every Wednesday, and it's pretty detailed. I've done 30 of them. And I recently put them in a living book on GitHub, put them in a book, and it literally looks like a book with chapters on people, but I didn't look at it like that. I looked at it like I'm writing articles every Wednesday. And over time in that book, there's going to be 200 people, right? So I think the key is not to, so Brandon Stanton of Humans of New York also talks about this. He said that when he first started, his goal of I'm going to photograph 10,000 people was so overwhelming. He was just overwhelmed by it, but he needed accountability, because if it was up to him, he wouldn't do it. Which sounds like it's kind of like what you're at the stage you're at now. So what he did was he needed public accountability, and nothing. I genuinely think if you think you're not motivated, if you're not whatever, doing something, publishing it in public and being under the scrutiny of other people is such a powerful motivator, because people suddenly, when there's an expectation and people are trusting you and relying on you to provide something, you feel the need to make them happy, basically. But what he did was he was like, okay, instead of think about 10,000, that's a lot. I'm going to start posting one post a day on Facebook. And he did it in public. He saw the comments, but he made himself do it every day because he was excited. I photographed 10 people today. Who am I going to put on Facebook today? So I think if you can create a system where you break it down so it's not so massive. So let's say you want to write about a book on X topic, and you think about each chapter as an article. Set aside some time every week and work on that article. And that article eventually turns into a chapter, because that's really all a chapter is.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's excellent.
Yeah, and Nadia had a great follow-up kind of related to exactly how to do the best homework to get these very human, vulnerable stories out. Want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was curious, how do you get people to share this human side with you? Is it you do really good homework? Is it you model sort of that vulnerability and humanness yourself? Is it something else? How do you sort of get to that deeper level?
Yeah. So right now, the dossiers are largely curated. There's one that I'm working on right now that I think I can actually interview the person in it, but a lot of times I don't get to talk to them. I'm just trying to learn from them. When I do profiles, it's so interesting. So again, Humans of New York, he does this. He goes up to them and he's able to conduct an Oprah-like interview where he's like, what was the worst moment in your life and why? And a lot of times these people are I literally don't know why I'm telling this guy this, but I'm just gonna do it. people always ask him, like, what do you do? And he's like, well, I'm 6'4", so I like hunch down a little bit. My voice gets really high. I try to make them comfortable. But the truth is, he's done so many of these where he wasn't good and he didn't get the good emotional stuff, where people were like, literally, goodbye, I do not want to do this. And he was rejected. Over time, he got better and better at making people comfortable just naturally. And I think like for me, I've never thought of myself as the most talented writer. I never thought I was like the smartest person, but I just know that like I have basic social skills where I can make people feel comfortable. And if they feel comfortable, like they'll tell you things that you want to know.
And I think that goes into like, I mean, everybody has to get started somewhere, right? Like we all, like I said, you have to really get over that initial hurdles, like putting stuff out there, getting feedback, which I think addresses one of Doug's question regarding like, when do you think you're ready? That's essentially like get it as like sooner rather than later, probably. And so I want to talk about like, so you've done profile for a while now, so you're definitely past the beginning. But what's the grand vision for the profile? Like, where do you see that going? Like, what do you intend to do with it? Or tell me more.
So I've been recently talking about this because it's just fresh in my mind, but I did a dossier and I watched a documentary on a chef called Grant Achatz. And Grant is incredibly innovative and he's very smart, and he basically, he's what society would call a truly original thinker. He'll go to a museum and he'll get an idea for his meal and how he wants to structure his dinner experience. He doesn't call his meals meals, he calls them experiences and chapters in a book. So he's a chef, but he's a storyteller. So when he goes to a museum, he looks at a piece of art and he's like, why can't I eat off of that? Like, I want to eat off of that. And who's to say that we need to eat from plates or bowls, or we need to do this motion when we eat? And normal people are like, well, because that's the way it's always been done. How are you not going to eat from a plate? And he challenges that all the time. So for example, he created a tablecloth that looks like a piece of art where people can eat off the tablecloth. To change the monotony of doing this motion when we eat, he created a food that could float. They made sugar into a helium balloon. They figured it out, it can float, it gets delivered to you, and you're like literally eating like this. It's definitely not the same motion. So it's like that level of innovation that I think a lot of us don't have. Elon Musk has it. These like genius, somewhat crazy people have it. For me, I was like, I think I'm an original thinker, until I read about this guy. I was like, never mind, I'm not original at all. Because what I've accepted until now is that a profile is text, 3,000 words on a person or company. Maybe sometimes you'll plop a video or an audio clip in there, but it's largely text. Why are we bound to how many words a magazine story galley could hold from the 1850s, right? Like, there has been very little innovation when it comes to reading things on the internet or experiencing someone's story. I would love to be more immersed in it, right? Like, I would love to know what it's like to have a day, to see a day in the life of Leon. Like, I would love that. But right now, I can only get it via text. So I was thinking actually about this today, so Humans of New York did, over the last few days, he's been releasing this story in little snippets on Facebook about this woman who was a go-go dancer in the 70s in New York. And she has such a rich life story, but she's alone. Nobody ever asked her about this stuff. Like, a stranger was curious enough to ask her these like fascinating questions and get her story. He has been writing this story. It's not finished yet. And he started a GoFundMe for her because she's having some issues with her leg and she needs help with medical bills. So he launched a GoFundMe. And when I last saw it a few hours ago, it was at $1.1 million for this lady, 78 years old. And I was like, how many people donated already? 50,000 people who read this woman's story, complete strangers, and they donated. I did the math. From 1.1 million divided by 50 is $22 on average. So people were willing to pull out their wallet and pay $22 to help her. I think that's true power. It's power because he knows that he has this massive, massive following. And he's very deliberate in what he uses it to do. This was one of those things. And what I found fascinating, though, was as I was reading it, I was like, damn, like the way she tells her own story, I get a much better idea of who she is as a person than if I read it, if a reporter wrote it, right? Because when a reporter, they kind of, whether you like it or not, the reporter includes a little bit of their beliefs and things in it. But for her, like the way she talks is like, yeah, I thought I was hot shit. And like, that, like you get it, right? So that's a new way of storytelling, and that is definitely a profile. So I don't know. It's just, I haven't figured it out yet. I don't know what the ultimate goal is, but I've been toying with the idea to have something called like the profile school or something like that, where people can go and they can learn directly from people. I just don't know what it looks like yet.
Got it. And I think for Grant, and you probably covered this in your article. I can't remember, but I think one of his like formative experiences was his whole ordeal with cancer, right? Like when he lost his sense of taste as a chef, and like I mean, as a chef, you can't taste. Like what are you going to do? Like that's so central to your identity. And I think a lot of people from the outside, like, oh, you've heard of Alinea before, you know it's a good restaurant, but like they don't, like there's all these things that you don't know about the person. Like per your point about like the about the profiles of these people and like all the donations raised, like it's, you want to try and humanize a person, and like you want to know as much as you can. And there's all these things that they are kind of like hidden from like the general public. So I want to flip that back to you in the sense of what do you wish that more people asked you about or knew about you?
Okay, so if you've been reading the profile for a good amount of time, you can probably sense that there's a theme of like identity. Like I just said, like what labels do to your psychology, like how people reinvent themselves, why some people use alter egos to be more confident, things like that. For me, somebody recently asked me like, wow, like how did you become a good writer when literally like this is, you came to the US not speaking English, not being able to write, whatever. So it's so interesting how like we think about this, because for me, the things I'm best at were my biggest insecurities. And I think that's true for a lot of people. When I came to the US, not being able to communicate, I was a super social kid in Bulgaria. The second I stepped in school, I was like, oh, well, I guess, you know, I don't have any friends and I can't speak the language and I can't write, which I loved writing. So because I over-rotated, because I wanted to prove that I was good, I over-rotated and I became like better than the people who were already good. So I think that, yeah, I think that it's just the people who have a lot of lessons to share, I think actually failed at a lot of stuff, or were insecure about a lot of things, or went through some shit that they're then able to be like, oh, okay, this is how I figured it out. And this is why I love people and learning from people, is because no institution or organization or professor will ever tell you this is how it was. Like one day there will be people teaching kids about 2020, but you will not understand what the pandemic meant to you, me, or someone living, you know, trying to, who's a single mom trying to make rent. It was completely different for me and for her. So if you're learning about 2020 and the pandemic as an abstract thing, you're not gonna get the same learning and experience as if you weren't listening, if you weren't putting yourself in the shoes of this mom with two kids who lost her job and trying to make rent versus me. So this is why I think like the importance of learning from humans is so interesting. Did I answer your question?
That's helpful.
Okay.
I think they had a point to make.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Well, I want to mention just briefly, I know we are running up against the hour that we'd sort of planned, and it feels like we have a lot of energy to go over. So if Polina, if you can, oh, there it is.
No, sorry. No. I don't know what that alarm was.
That's your 6 o'clock alarm.
Yeah.
Well, I guess 9 o'clock over by you.
No.
But we'll keep rolling for a little bit.
Yeah,
I can't believe the hour already flew by. Which actually brings me to a kind of a related question. Maybe it's a little bit separate, but related to something that Laurel was asking around kind of what you have energy for with the shorter pieces, longer pieces. There's a broader concept that I feel like I run into all the time when meeting entrepreneurs or working on products, and I think it probably must also exist in the content world, which is where people kind of go toward where they have interest. And I think so much of our lives we're sort of told growing up, like, you should study this and grit through it and work hard, and you should go run, and it's going to be painful and sweaty, but it's going to be good afterwards. And there's all these aspects of any kind of process that were kind of institutionalized to work through the pain. And then I think sometimes when you just let yourself go to where you are interested, like you want to go do Humans in New York, you want to just start taking photos, or you want to try creating a different way to eat where you've got your mouth in the air. You just like you're almost like playing. You're not doing it because it fits into a form. And I wonder, like, do you feel yourself a natural tension between things that you have energy for or things that feel like a slog? And do you try to focus on one or the other? Do you have a balance, or do you go all energy or all commitment, or how does that balance live in your life?
So there's people who will be like, you should have criteria for who you feature in the profile. And I'm like, I don't want to do that, because I naturally gravitate to really complicated characters who I'm fascinated by, and I want to include them. I'm not going to have some like this many people and that many people and this type of person. Like, I naturally gravitate to people who are interesting to me. But I will say that sometimes, like, when you're like, well, do whatever you love, it's hard because some people don't know that, or like they haven't done enough to know what they love. I always say, like, constraint breeds creativity and innovation. So even if you don't have, like, I think a lot of people like, should I write short? Should I write long? That's the wrong question to ask. I think so many of our lives is like, you should be like, is this the right question to be asking in this situation? Because length does not matter. That's the wrong question. What matters is, what am I writing? Can I convey it in a way that's going to resonate with people? Forget how long it is. You can always cut it if you want to, but like you're starting with the wrong metric to focus on. So for me, it's always like I'm interested, or I'm like pulled in a direction. Then I'm like, hold on a second. Am I doing this because I feel like I should be? Because, like, this is the right, like, I mean, I've been going back and forth on what a profile looks like for so long. I'm like, is it a podcast? Is it a video series? Like, I don't know, but you shouldn't think about the format. You should think about the story and what you want to do and tell, and the experience you want to have, or you want the reader to have. And then the format will kind of like come out from there. Humans of New York, that format didn't exist before him. Grant Achatz, Alinea, that sort of restaurant didn't really exist before him. So yeah, I think it's just like, focus on like the meat of what you want to do, and the format follows versus the other way around.
And I think related to that whole format and constraint creativity, Asha has a good question, just generally like how you got started. Asha, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was the question. I'm just curious how you decided to compile profiles rather than, writing about something else that might be interesting.
Yeah, so I was really, like, in school, I was always really bad, like, in history. I hated history because of that exact thing. Like, we were always talking about these time periods in time that were like abstract things. There was never emotion. There were figures, there were people, but we never got super deep in one person's story. And the way I memorize things and when I remember things is that I need to feel emotionally connected to a person to get it. So at Fortune, I just like Patty Sellers, like I really liked her. She was an editor because she wrote profiles. She profiled Martha Stewart and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. She recently did a podcast. You should listen to it. It's great. But she talked about how all her coworkers were like, "Ugh, you're interviewing Martha Stewart? Like, how annoying is she?" And she's like, I think she's fascinating. Like, how are you not fascinated by this person? And I don't have the same reaction that a lot of reporters, like, I can't stand this person. I would never want to interview them. I'm like, the crazier, the better, like bring them on. So I saw somebody in the chat said this at one point, but I started really getting into profiles when, like I've always liked them, but I never like thought about them like, oh, this is a profile. My coworker sent me a profile on Justin Bieber, someone I did not care for. I did not really, I knew about him, but I wasn't like a believer? So I was like the anti-believer, but I read it and I was like, holy shit, this is fascinating. He's like, it gave me a perspective on Justin Bieber that I don't know that I needed, but like I think I needed. It made like a really good profile. Katie Weaver, who wrote that profile on Justin Bieber, says this. She's like, it's been proven that the reason people really like looking at slow motion is because the brain can process all the detail and it's like satisfying to it. The same with a profile. It's like you slow somebody down and you show all the details and your brain can properly process it and it feels good. Justin Bieber is fascinating because I thought I was going to read about like him singing and whatever, but what I actually read about is like, what a complicated human. And one of the things was the reporter says that she's sitting and like you and I are talking and she's talking to Justin and he just like stares at you. He doesn't back channel. Back channeling, any culture, any language, any person in the world, when somebody's talking, you usually say, you smile and you nod. See, you nodded. Things like that to let me know that you're listening or you're like liking my jokes or whatever. Justin does not, he has no sense of that. So he just like stares and she's like, I didn't know how to interact with him because he's so peculiar. So like little things like that you are memorable and makes Justin Bieber way more human than like anything I'll ever watch or see him say or anything like that. So you need outside observers in some ways, but to me, it's like, I'm so passionate about profiles for that reason. Like, let's humanize everybody.
So on this topic of humanizing people, making them more relatable, I think Peregrine also has a good question on that. Peregrine, do you want to go?
Wait, can I just answer this question really fast?
Yeah,
Doesn't not back channeling make him less human? Yes, but no, because what I was trying to say is like by him not being a member of society and like knowing that this is a norm, it makes him like not this like star. It makes him just like a regular 16-year-old or whatever he was at the time. I was like, oh, okay, like you're just regular. Sorry.
Yeah, that was actually like essentially my question, which is you kind of mentioned things like somebody being like normal in some way or peculiar in some way, or like their personal failings that it's like the hero is not relatable until they have personal feeling or personal failings. And I was curious like what other things you would like put in that bucket of like types of things that get you to know someone really quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what's so interesting about profiles. If you and me, probably not that different. Like, yeah, like depending on life experiences, whatever. But I wrote a profile on this investor one time, Jeff Jordan, and I really struggled with it because like, it's hard, it's hard to get to somebody's like essence, like what makes you you, right? And I find that it's like the quirks in the context of what's normal. So there's another great profile on someone I don't care that much about. Hold on. Was it Cardi B?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Cardi B. Okay, I don't think it's Cardi B. I'll look it up later. She was like a rapper. The reporter went in super excited. She was like, this is my first article. I think it was for GQ. I'm probably making all this up right now. But anyway, she went in, and the point of the story is she went in to interview her, and oh no, it was Nicki Minaj. Sorry, Cardi B. Oh my God, Nicki Minaj. She went in and she fell asleep like during the interview, and the reporter was like, oh shit, like what do I do now? I only have like half an hour with her anyway, and she's like asleep. So she's in the chair and she nodded off, and so like the reporter's like, hey, excuse me, like can we, and then she fell asleep again. I think the headline or the message of the story ended up being like, if you worked as hard as Nicki Minaj does, you'd be tired too. So it's like those small quirks, right? Like somebody like me who's super type A, anxious, whatever, high alert, I would never fall asleep ever. Like even if I'm on my last leg of energy. But I just think it's cool because you can see that there's a reason that reporters go and do like experiences and activities with their subjects for a profile. It's because you want to see them interact with humans. You want to see how they act in this situation. It gives context to regular, normal human behavior. And when it veers off, it gets super interesting.
I got a question. When you are meeting somebody like a Nicki Minaj or a Justin Bieber, what's sort of your calling card? Is it the fact that you have this entity, this media publication? Is it the existing audience? Is it kind of your personal network? Or how do you sort of get somebody like a Nicki Minaj excited about kind of being profiled?
I don't know if she'd be excited. She'd probably fall asleep if it was me. So I, again, thought about this today because I've been struggling with this lately. When I was at Fortune, any email, I've interviewed Melinda Gates, Steve Schwartzman, all these people that normal reporters be like, oh my God, like that's amazing. The reason I was in that room was because my email had @fortune.com at the end of it. Let's be real. But when I left and I started doing the profile, I was like, I started emailing all these people that I was like, no brainer. And then they didn't respond. So today, finally, one person who I've been trying to interview literally since I was in college responded. And they were like, yeah, sure, like, let's do it. And I was like, oh my God. But the way that I do it is I do research on the person. I try to find something similar, like, you know, did we graduate from the same school? Do we have an overlapping like interest or something like that, where you can, again, show that you're a human and also say like, I have this media platform. I think it's so cool. Like when somebody like Elon Musk does what could be a book on Neuralink on one of his companies and gives the exclusive to Wait But Why. That is a blog.
Yep.
That is not a media publication. And when people do that, they show that they trust the person who's writing, the person who's doing it. And that's kind of the card I try to play. Like, you know, I've worked at these places. I've established myself as a reporter. Will you trust me enough to do this with me? And I think like, especially now as the trend becomes people trusting people versus institutions, I think you're going to see more of that.
Great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I also actually have a question. We've talked a lot about sort of how you engage the subjects of your pieces, but I'm also curious about how you think about engaging your readers and like your audience. And how do you measure audience engagement for yourself? There's so many different avenues you have that people could reach you by, like email, Substack, Twitter, probably a bunch of things. So what's your thinking around that?
Yeah, so actually, as much as I talk about like, you know, the subjective part of writing, I'm incredibly like very hardcore in measuring analytics. So I connect Substack to Google Analytics, and I look at what people are reading, because the best way to, like, when you ask people like, oh, what would you like to read? They'll tell you one thing and then they'll end up reading a totally different thing because people don't know what they want. But the way that, for me, it's like, first of all, when I'm writing and I'm thinking about the reader, I think about like, the question I keep asking myself over and over again is, will they care? Will they care that the person I'm writing about went to the University of Georgia? Probably not. Let's cut that out. So I always think about it as like, what I find interesting, I think other people will find interesting. It's more like when I'm telling a friend a story, what do I lead with? Like, how do I want to surprise them? And then there's a little suspense and a little tension. So that's kind of how I write. But for analytics, definitely Google Analytics. And then Substack also like tells you by story breakdown who read what. But I'm obsessive about that because it shows me what people, when I'm not asking them, what they actually are reading. I wrote a post about 100, this was a little bit off brand for the profile, but 100 readers shared their best relationship advice, and I wrote a whole post on that. That is the best performing thing on the Substack, on my Substack. And I'm like, okay, but I write profiles and dossiers and all this stuff, and that one is popular. But that's the thing, like, you can see what people like and you can say, okay, that's a little bit of a departure. I'm not going to keep writing about like relationships, but you can kind of like be like, oh, okay, so they'll never tell me they're reading this, but like they do.
So I think Christian also has a good question on this in terms of like how you picked how you pick one what you want to write about. Christian, do you want to go? Is Christian around? Christian pronounced Carl. Oh, yes.
You can also go for Max. Max has a really good one too.
Yeah, I guess Max, do you want to go into it?
Yeah, thanks so much for being with us tonight. This is fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about your editing process? Like, who edits your work? Like, do you have a formula set up, from your days at Term Sheet? Like, how does it get done?
If I tell you that nobody edited my work at Term Sheet, no. So editing is so important. And when you do something every single day, like you do get better, but you always need like another pair of eyes. A lot of the times, so here's a tip, like if you don't have an editor, because like right now I don't have a regular editor, I always try to read it to someone else. And the reason I say that is the best thing you can do when you write something to edit it yourself, the best way is to read it out loud. Because your eyes will skip over mistakes, but like when you're reading it, you catch it as you speak. So every single thing I write, like I read out loud, hopefully to someone who will listen. But for the stories that like really matter and the ones that I'm not nervous about, but like I want it to turn out really well, I have a lot of friends who are still, at publications and stuff, so I can just ask them for a favor to send it to them so they can look it over. But honestly, it doesn't even have to be that. It could literally be your mom or your sister or whatever. I was listening to a podcast with Tim Urban, who writes Wait But Why? And the fact, look, have you read the Elon Musk posts that he did?
No, but I will.
Okay. Incredible. But not only is the writing strong, the storytelling is very strong. He's not a writer. I'm sure he didn't go to journalism school. The person on the podcast was asking him who edited it. He said he sent it to his mom, his sister, and somebody else, but like they weren't like a legit editor or whatever. But based on all of their comments, he was able to piece it together and make it really good, especially because he was writing about brain machine interfaces. Like that's such a niche topic, and it's so complicated. You need people like his sister to be able to say like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. So just create like a board of editors that are always willing to kind of read your work. But for me, right now, it's irregular.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I do want to flag the time because we are already 20 minutes over, so we should start wrapping up soon. But I know we have one more question from Nadia that I want to introduce. Then we've got some a few closing announcements, and we actually have a question that we're going to turn the tables and ask you, Polina.
Awesome.
So why don't we transition to Nadia, and you can take it from here.
Yeah, oh my gosh, this is like so engaging. But I guess my question is, like, a couple points back, you had a point about like wanting to profile people that you disagreed with or that are different from you. And I'm curious, like, is there ever a time where you wouldn't profile someone either because of like who they are or what they stand for? And I guess I'm wondering, like, is it always sort of good to see people as people, which like I think so, or are there times where it may be like bad actually to try to humanize someone because they're super sketchy or doing something that's like, you know, sort of bad for the world?
Wow. So I'm gonna say, wait, the question was, would I ever not profile? I would like to say no. Like I would always want to profile, no matter even if they were like the bane of evil, just because. Okay, it may sound really cheesy, but I promise it has a point. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, always like said, basically like, no matter, what did he say? He said, always try to see people as children, right? Like no matter how much you disagree and how horrible of a human you think they are, like they've probably had experiences that shaped them in this way. And I genuinely think you can learn a lesson from every person, even if they haven't made the best decisions or if they're terrible. And I actually think one of the most harmful things in society today is that we don't give people second chances. And it's just like, it's like somebody does something, there's a media storm, and then you see them all over the place, then you never hear from them again. I don't think it used to be that way, but I think now, like the fact that we don't allow for that second chance kind of takes away from a lot.
Yeah, that's great. I like that it helps us kind of wrap on a bit of a uplifting or inspirational thing. I don't find it cheesy at all.
Okay, good.
I like Fred Rogers a lot myself. Every time I watch that movie, I think I've seen it a couple times already.
Yeah, Tom Hanks is great.
So this has been awesome. I know we are coming to the end of the time we were planning to spend together. And I do have that one final question for Polina where we're going to turn the tables. But before that, I wanted to close with a few quick announcements. First, thank you to the Renaissance Collective for showing up in rare form, as always. So much good energy, and obviously Leon being Renaissance Collective connector here. And so many great questions. So thank you, Renaissance Collective. It's been fun to collab, and thank you, Polina, for spending the time with us. We really appreciate it. I mean, you can just see the numbers. Everybody's so engaged. You can see the chat going
Awesome.
Crazy. So definitely really so much energy in this room. I really appreciate that you spent the time with us.
I loved it.
And we can stay tuned for future town halls. We've got a link to highlighter.com/discover where we've got some upcoming pieces coming up. We've got Eugene Wei talking about TikTok, as he has been publishing lately, and Annie Duke, and she's talking about her new book that's coming out. Tomas Tunguz is talking about narrative economics, and you can stay tuned on our blog and YouTube. And if you have any favorite writers who you think would be great guests on Highlighter Live, you can DM us names. We're at Highlight Ideas on Twitter, and we'd love to get names of people that you'd like to hear from and talk to. So we'll conclude with our question. So we've spent all night asking you questions, and we like to turn the tables and give you the chance to ask us, and us meaning the people in the room or the broader world. What's your one question for the world, or what are you most curious about today?
Ooh. Okay. What? Who is the person that you've learned the most from?
That's great. Who is the person you've learned the most from? That's fantastic. I think everybody's thinking. You can see sort of the wheels turning in the eyes of.
I'm just curious. I'm curious if it's going to be like a person you're related to or not, or somebody you've never met.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to be more people that like they don't really know in person, or do you think it's going to tilt more towards a relative, a teacher that I knew growing up?
See, that's the thing, because it depends how you define it, right? Like, yes, I could say I've learned everything from my mom, which is probably true, but there are certain ideas that have like changed my life that I've learned from people I've never met.
Well, that's great food for thought. Well, we'll kick off a Twitter thread and loop everybody in, and we can follow up there. Thanks so much, everybody.
Of course.
Thanks, Polina.
Thank you, guys.